Hello and welcome to Majlis and Markets, a podcast where we explore the trends shaping Islamic and global markets. I am your host, Hassan Javraj. If you enjoy this episode, be sure to like, share, and subscribe. And don't forget to leave us a rating. You can also follow us on LinkedIn and Instagram at Majlis and Markets, or drop me a line at hassan@majlisandmarkets.com. Today I'm excited to be joined by Jihad Yazigi, founder and editor-in-chief of the Syria Report, a leading source on Syria's economy and political landscape. During our wide-ranging conversation, we took a deep dive into Syria's political economy, how it developed, the factors that led up to the 2011 uprising, and the subsequent transformations over the past 14 years. We also explore the challenges ahead and what they mean for Syria's future. Jihad Yazigi, welcome to Majlis and Markets. Great to have you here.
Thank you, Hassan.
Jihad, I was just telling you offline, I'm really happy to talk to you because, I have my own personal anecdotes. Many people might not know that I actually studied Arabic in Syria many, many years ago in 2010. And I have my own personal anecdotes of the country and the economy over there. And I was just saying to you also that I used to read your report, the Syria Economic Report. It was really a fantastic newsletter that was, providing information about the Syrian economy in the English language. And it was really like a fantastic weekly newsletter you used to write. And it was really helpful to me when I was writing essays or when I was wanting to just read about the financial news that wasn't, published by the government at the time. So, that was a really fantastic thing. And I really thank you for coming on the podcast. But Jihad, like I said, you've got a fantastic background and I'm really excited to chat to you. And I'm really want to talk to you about what's happened since December and talk to you about what the challenges are in Syria going forward. But before we get into all of that, Jihad, could you give our listeners your early life and your background story?
Yes, well, thank you, Hassan, for having me again. Yes, so actually, I am. I happen to be half Syrian, half Lebanese. My father is Syrian, my mom is Lebanese. I grew up my early life in West Africa, in Ghana. Moved to France as a teenager. Studied here, then had to interrupt my studies after the death of my father in West Africa. So I moved back to Nigeria. Well, all this to say that I had a life before working on the Syria report that had nothing to do with Syria or with writing on the economy. Then in 2001, a year after Bashar Al-Assad arrived to power, I was in Paris. I was looking for a job. I was sending CVs. And then I had, it was the very early years of internet, actually. So I began a blog. At the time, we would call that blogs. We would call it e-zine, a blog about Syria in English. People don't realize this, but at the time, there was absolutely nothing in foreign languages on Syria. And myself, as a Syrian expat, I was very frustrated about that. I felt it was pretty unfair that the country that I really loved was so little known outside of its borders. So I started doing summaries of press articles written in Arabic. I would summarize them in English. And then suddenly, quite shortly after I began publishing this small blog, I got an email from the World Bank, a guy from the World Bank telling me, wow, thank you for that service. This is really very useful. Then I realized that this could be a business opportunity. And that's how in October 2001, I was in Paris in a flat. So as I said, still looking for a job. And I transformed a blog without any previous background in journalism, without having even completed my university studies, without much savings. I began this blog on this. I basically transformed my blog into a website on the Syrian economy. So that's how, if you want, I began my work on Syria before I'm in the very early years of the Bashar al-Assad's rule.
Amazing. And did you study economics or finance beforehand?
Yes. I was studying actually international business administration at the American University in Paris. And my father, who had set up a business, so my father was an expat, a Syrian expat who went to Ghana, then moved to Nigeria after 1973 and the increase of the price of oil and the big business opportunities in Nigeria. So he moved to Nigeria, and unfortunately he passed away. It was during my last year of study at university. So I had to basically stop and go to Lagos to take over the business. So, but I had already a background in business, and I was actually very interested in in economics and business affairs. And to this day, actually, to be very honest with you, Hassan, I mean, I even I like dealing with businessmen. I like the proximity business people have with real life, while at the same time very interested in the intellectual life. So I've always had this mix of interest in if you want, in public subjects, in general subjects of political life, and in business and economic matters. So, and yes, so I had this initial academic background in these issues.
Fantastic. And Jihad, like, did you have any work experience prior to taking over the family business?
Not at all. I was a student in Paris. So my father passes away. It was a family business. So my uncle was also part controlling the business. So I went to Nigeria. I learned everything there. The first 3 years. Well, I spent 3 years there. It was a very important period of my life because I basically worked for the first time in my life, had to manage I mean, until then, I was a student receiving pocket money from his father and enjoying his life in Paris. So you can imagine the difference having to move to West Africa, discover a new country, manage a company. And then there was, as unfortunately often it happens, a family dispute. So I had to leave Lagos. So it was quite a very important period of my life that taught me a lot of things about work, of course, but also personal relations to money, to power, to a lot of things actually. But it was my first work experience actually there.
And the Syria report, you mentioned about that. Tell me a little bit more about that. How did that all become like more formalized?
Yeah, well, actually, I'm a big I like newspapers. I've always loved that. I mean, and to this day, actually, most of my friends are journalists. I like asking questions. I like the nuanced way journalists work. I mean, the mentality they have, and so it really began as I told you as a blog initially. I was looking for a job, so I thought, let me have a bit of fun. And when I realized that there was a real gap, I mean, when you get an email from the World Bank telling you, well, you are filling a gap, I realized, well, that's really a business opportunity here. There is. Let me try doing it. So I began it, and initially I wasn't really sure what I wanted to write on it, in it, sorry. So that's why it's called the Syria Report. It's not called the Syria Economic Report or the Syria Business Report. It was called the Syria Report. I, on the one hand, I was very interested in economic issues, and on the other hand, I knew that I had to be cautious because obviously Bashar may have been slightly a bit more liberal than his father, but it was still a very authoritarian regime. And although I was in Paris, I still wanted to travel regularly to Syria, to my home country. And so I decided to take the economic angle, but economic in the broader sense of it. So it includes political economy, it includes business, it includes that includes macroeconomy, finance, obviously. And I also saw the Syria report as a means to accompany the liberalization of the Syrian economy. And initially it began really as, at the very beginning, it was really a summary of what the Syrian press began, at least the first few months of it, before it became really a newspaper. And then gradually it transformed into, if you want, a trade publication and what it is today, which is a much larger, if you want, database of companies, institutions, documents of all sorts, legal documents, plus news and analysis articles. But that's how it all began in Paris in 2001. And then later I moved to Damascus in 2005. And, there was a number of stages in the development of the publication.
Amazing, amazing. And Jihad, what do you do today? Are you still with the Syria report, or what's your gig today?
Yes, absolutely. I still manage the Syria report. So it has developed into a much larger outfit, really. I mean, so we have a main website. It's a subscription website. So we are actually the oldest online publication on Syria that is still running to this day. And to my knowledge, we are the first publication in the Middle East, online publication in the Middle East, to charge for its content. We have this main news publication with a data set of companies and various documents. Then we have a separate subsite which is called the Official Documents Database, where we basically publish the Syrian Official Gazette of the government. We have amassed thousands of documents, PDF documents that are searchable. Then we have another subsite dedicated to housing, land, and property rights in Syria. That's a project that is funded by, that's an open access, it's an open access website. I run another website called the Syrian Observer, which translates the Syrian press into English. I do consultancy for a number of institutions. I am an associate fellow with the European Council on Foreign Relations and with the Issam Faris Institute at the American University of Beirut. So all my work is Syria related, but the Syria report remains my core my core business, if you want. So basically, updating decision makers around the world about the latest economic and financial developments of Syria. That's really the core of my work.
Fantastic. Jihad, it's really a great report. Like even when I read it back in 2010, 11, it was a really fantastic report. But Jihad, before we get into like the Syrian economy, you started the Syria report in 2001 and you're talking about like going back to Damascus in the early 2000s. From your perspective, right? What did you think of when Bashar al-Assad became president in 2000?
Interesting question. To be honest, I was very hesitant. And what I remember is that in early 2001, Bashar gave an interview to an Arabic newspaper. I think it was Sharq al-Awsat. And what struck me is that he was asked a question about an old Syrian opposition person called Riyad al-Turk, who had stayed like more than 20 years in prison under his father. And the way he talked about Riyad al-Turk was an old person who had really no much power left. He talked about him with very little respect. And I thought, this is strange from someone like, I mean, in Syria, Hassan, in our societies, you usually show respect for old people. And I thought, well, there's a problem with that guy. I mean, why does he need to show such little respect for an old person who doesn't represent any significant threat for him? And that was early 2001. So I always thought myself, well, there's a problem with that guy. But at the same time, I told myself two things. First of all, clearly the guy is obliged to liberalize the economy. So liberalizing the economy means he's going to give away power, influence to more actors. So he's probably going to give away more political, to make political concessions. That's on the one hand. Then on the second, I had a lot of people around me who were very optimistic about Bashar. And myself, being an expat, having not grown in Syria, I had a problem of legitimacy. And I always felt, well, maybe I don't know Syria as much as others do. So I always had this doubt about my own judgment about him. So I told myself, okay, some people are optimistic and think that he's going to reform. I'm personally not so optimistic, but let's give it a try and we will see what happens. That's actually one of the motivations behind me doing the Syria report. But for example, my position throughout my stay in Syria, Hassan, was that I would never request any meeting with Bashar al-Assad, nor with his wife, Asma al-Assad. So I don't want to commit myself to let them feel that taking the risk of me pushing too much forward their agenda. So I always had these doubts about him, but I was never fully sure if my own judgment was really the correct one. So yeah, hesitant, I would say. I felt that there was an opportunity for Syria, whether Bashar wanted it really to reform or not, and that this opportunity, we had to seize it. So that was my mindset, if you want, during that period.
Yeah, because what I was going to ask you is like, I would say probably from like 2000 to 2005, people were still trying to figure out Bashar al-Assad. And then, I think you said you went back to Syria in 2005 or was living there in 2005. And
Yeah.
a lot of things happened in 2005. You had the assassination of Rafik al-Hariri in Lebanon. And then a year later, I think Hezbollah and Israel went to war. And then also during this period, I think Bashar liberalized a lot of the society or appeared to be liberalizing society. What was that period like between, say, 2000 and 2005 or six?
Yeah, I mean, to say the truth, Hassan, I mean, the whole period of the first 10 years of Bashar were a period of both economic liberalization with really some benefits, and relative societal liberalization, relative, to the extent that actually you had some Syrians, expats returning to Syria. The art scene was booming. I mean, you had some really positive aspects. Now, the first period, 2000 to 2005, I was not myself living in Syria. I was in France, although I traveled regularly to Damascus. It was a hesitant period. It was the first few years of Bashar al-Assad. Everybody was a bit hesitant about which direction the country would be taking. We realized that the guy was liberalizing a bit economically. Politically, there were some very initial promises. You may remember, or people may have read about the Damascus Spring in 2000, but he quite quickly backtracked and arrested people from 2001, really. So the feeling was that he was slightly moving forward economically, very hesitant, but not very liberal politically during that period. And really, the big moment, as you mentioned, it was really the 2005 moment, which ended up with the death of Hariri, another, which itself resulted in the withdrawal of the Syrian army from Lebanon, which was actually a major strategic defeat for Syria because Syria had been in Lebanon since 1976 for 30 years. That was in the early summer of 2005. And then in September of 2005, the Bashar organizes a meeting of the Ba'ath Party to adopt what they called at the time the social market economic development model, basically acknowledging that the socialist model doesn't apply anymore to Syria. And that the economy had to liberalize much faster. So he had already liberalized, but from 2005 onwards, they decided to liberalize much faster. And to some extent, this had to do with their withdrawal from Lebanon, because the Syrian army's presence in Lebanon enabled the government and a lot of people around the regime to make basically a lot of money in different ways. So 2005 was really a crucial moment. The first period was one of hesitation from 2000 to 2005, and then the second part from 2005 and 2010 was one of an acceleration in economic reform, although politically there wasn't much, very little really concessions or opening.
Yeah, I was going to ask you, like between 2005 and 2010, it seemed like, you'd have people like Charlie Rose from Bloomberg visiting Damascus, and then you'd have articles by CNBC writing about Syria being the next big market or the most untapped market. And there was a lot of like positive press from the West. And I would also say, I think there was technocratic people surrounding Bashar's government at the time, albeit, it wasn't like a democracy. But like you had people like this guy, what's his face, Abdullah Dadari, I think.
Correct.
Yeah,
Yeah.
people like him were helping facilitate this like kind of liberalization, right?
Yeah. Yeah, correct. Absolutely. If you want, Hassan, actually, it really began at the. I mean, here we can go. I don't want to go back too much in history, but the problems of the Syrian economy date back quite a while. Actually, they date back to his father, to the mid 1980s. Really, at the time, Hafez, his father, realized that the economy had major problems. But one major thing that delayed tremendously the reform drive of the Syrian economy is the fact that in the late 1980s, the Syrians, well, not the Syrians, I mean really Shell and Total, discovered oil in eastern Syria. And so suddenly Syria's production of crude oil increased significantly, which brought significant fiscal margins of maneuver to the government. And during the whole 1990s, while the government was initially expected to liberalize the economy, we are talking of the period of Bashar's father, Hafez al-Assad, the government did not liberalize because it did manage to get a lot of funding. So it reduced the pressure on the government. At the same time, for people who remember or who have read about that period, you had the Iraq invasion of Kuwait and the American intervention. And because Syria stood with the US, Syria received a lot of funding from the Gulf, which helped Syria fund its infrastructure, its power plants, telecom infrastructure. All of this to say that during the 1990s, Syria received a lot of funding, which delayed economic reform. When Bashar arrives in power in 2000, there was already realization that these sources of funding were drying up. Crude output, oil output had declined quite quickly. It had peaked in 1996 at 600,000 and above 650, if I remember well. We were already talking of less than 500,000 when Bashar came to power, or even maybe less than 400,000. I forgot really the figure. So when Bashar arrives to power, he realizes that the situation is not sustainable. We need to do something. So arrives 2005, and here again, you realize that, okay, we are out of Lebanon, we are a bit stuck, we need to liberalize. So he brings here technocrats. He brings Dadari. Before Dadari, he brought Ghassan Rifai, who was a World Bank consultant, actually. And he brought Issam Zaim, who was a UNDP consultant. But these two guys, Ghassan Rifai and Issam Zaim, were brought actually before 2005. The difference between them and Dadari, that both of them were important international experts, but they knew little of the Syrian economy, of the Syrian bureaucracy, of the Syrian state. So they had their knowledge of the economy, but real little knowledge of how the state functioned, and so they really struggled to do any reform. Dardari didn't have the economic credentials of these other two guys, but knew much better the functioning of the state, and so he brought Dardari. But you have a lot of other people, as you correctly pointed out, who were asked to get involved in helping the reform of the Syrian state. Later, after the French resumed their relation with the Syrians asked for support from the French, and the French sent an expert to support, for example, the central bank. You had the Europeans, you had the German GTZ, which is now GIZ, the German technical development consultancy, also supporting the Syrian state. So you had a realization, if you want, Hassan, at this period, by the Syrian authority, by Bashar al-Assad, that the Syrian economy had to reform, that the Syrian state had to reform in order to modernize, to attract investment, to cope with the needs of its society, of high demographic pressure, unemployment pressure, need to export, and so on and so forth. All, if you want, all the demands and requirements of a modern liberalizing economy.
With the liberalization that was taking place, Jihad, in that 2000s period, it's fair to say that it probably wasn't like privatization wasn't real privatization. You had people like Rami Makhlouf who were benefiting from a lot of this liberalization and privatization. Like it wasn't like a straightforward like compared to like other countries, right?
Absolutely. Actually, you never really had in Syria privatization in the technical sense of the term, which is the sale of state assets to private investors. What the government started doing is transferring the management of some state assets to the private sector. So, for example, the container terminals in the ports of Latakia and Tartus were transferred in 2008 and 2009 to two international companies. One of them is CMA-CGM, the French shipping giant, which manages to this day the container terminal of the Latakia port. You had some few examples like that. And then you had the example you gave, which is basically granting private investors, the right to run mobile phone networks. So you didn't have before the introduction of when the mobile networks were introduced in the market, they immediately went to the private sector. So again, you didn't have a process of some state assets being sold. But obviously, a sector such as mobile phone networks, which was extremely lucrative, was handed over to the cousin of Bashar al-Assad in a process which was obviously highly corrupt. One of the two networks went to Bashar's cousin. The other went to a company owned by Najib Miati, the longtime Lebanese prime minister, with some unclear links to the wife of Bashar al-Assad. So yes, so the problem, if you want, is that it wasn't a clearly assumed privatization process, and it was a highly corrupt process. So that was among the problems that you had during the liberalization process of that period. Actually, a government official told me after 2010, when we were discussing in Beirut, he told me, look, Jihad, I mean, all the big contracts, 40% of them went to Rami, 40% of them went to Maher, and Maher, who is the brother of Bashar al-Assad. And the 20 were distributed to other players. And that's he was talking of the big contracts. So it may have been an exaggeration, but this is to say that not only in terms of handing over some assets to the private sector, but also in terms of contracting to the private sector. The process was highly corrupt, really, and largely to the benefit of people close to the palace.
Yeah, I'll give you like a personal anecdote. I had a friend of mine, a Syrian friend of mine, who was friends with a guy who knew the Didiman brand hotel in Turkey, and I remember speaking to them, and they said like they wanted to open a new hotel in Damascus, and but when they realized they'd have to give Rami Makhlouf some of the profit, they were kind of a little bit like, okay, we don't want to do this too much, opening this kind of hotel. I mean, like it wasn't like the most business friendly environment, right, at the time.
Absolutely, absolutely. That's very interesting, and I'm happy someone like you had the opportunity to hear this while you were there. You have plenty of stories like this, Hassan. And what is striking actually is the difficulties you had to actually launch any significant investment in Syria. You had very, very few major investment taking off to the extent that you can basically name them. So I can mention, for example, in terms of big, I mean, despite the fact that Syrians were really wanted to push investment in the tourism sector, you have one big international brand that really opened a hotel in Syria, which is the Four Seasons Hotel, and that's to some extent because it's a brand owned by at the time by the Saudis. And okay, so that worked, but ourselves we wrote about I don't know how many other projects that never really took off, despite the fact that you had the impression that they were really backed by powerful people in Syria. And despite this, you had obstacles, plenty of obstacles. I can mention also, for example, a story that is well known: McDonald's. Apparently, McDonald's wanted to open, not only McDonald's, Burger King, KFC, none of them managed to open because the environment was so corrupt. One funny anecdote here, Hassan. Kentucky Fried Chicken wanted to open a chain of restaurants in Damascus. So the company that has the regional franchise for KFC is a company in Kuwait, Khurafi Group. So they initially opened it as KFC, Kentucky Fried Chicken. And then someone in the regime opposed it, and they say, no, you can't do it. I don't know what type of obstacle they put in front of them. So basically, they kept the KFC brand, but instead of being Kentucky Fried Chicken, it became the Kuwaiti Food Company. So it remained its KFC brand, but they had to change from the name to Kuwaiti Food Company. And you had plenty of examples. Mercedes-Benz, for instance, Mercedes-Benz. Brahmi Makhlouf wanted to be the Mercedes-Benz agent, and Mercedes-Benz said at the time, no, we have our agent, the Sankar family, so we only deal with them. Rami took the Sankar family to court. The Sankar family initially, we actually wrote about it. That was in the early 2000s. The Sankar family won the court case. The judges that made the decisions in favor of the Sankar family were, of course, dismissed. Eventually, Rami won it, and Mercedes-Benz said, well, no, we are not giving it to you. And you couldn't buy, there was no Mercedes-Benz agent in Syria during the whole period before 2011. And so you have plenty of similar cases. And this gives you an idea of the extent of the corruption in the country before 2011.
Yeah, that KFC, I think I remember it very vividly. It was in Abu Ramani, if I'm not mistaken. I remember going there. It was quite a surreal experience. Everyone was very dressed up going to this KFC. And obviously, KFC, like, you wouldn't really get dressed up in the West to go, but like it was very interesting watching like Syrian people get dressed up to go to like a place. I think also I remember Costa Coffee in Four Seasons. A lot of people were getting dressed up at the time because I think it was the first foreign chain to open a coffee shop in the Four Seasons. But Jihad, I just want to, on this point, like of the Gulf, Joshua Landis, he mentioned on a podcast recently that Hafiz al-Assad had a very good relationship with the Saudi kingdom and some of the other Gulf countries. Would you say that, there was a lot of Gulf investment coming up until 2011, right, from the Gulf countries?
Yes, I mean, Gulf investments were rising. It is true. I wouldn't say there were a lot, but it is true that they were increasing. The Qataris were investing a bit, the Saudis were investing, but given the potential of the economy, I mean, frankly, Hassan, the Syrian economy probably has one of the most, if not the most, diversified economies in the Middle East. So obviously, it doesn't have at all the potential in terms of overall size of economies in the Gulf, such as Saudi Arabia or any other, because of the huge revenues generated by oil. But in terms of the diversity, you had real potential. You had agriculture, manufacturing, tourism, great potential in terms of transport and logistics hub, low production costs for manufacturing. A lot of sectors were underdeveloped and had a lot of potential, say, for example, finance, upscale real estate. So really plenty of sectors. And while, so as you are saying, there were indeed investment from the Gulf, they were below, I think, what the country could really have absorbed. But of course, Syria had, if you want, had managed. Hafez was really a great political strategist. He also committed a lot of crimes against his population. That's a different aspect, different thing, of course. But he was certainly a great political strategist, and he had managed to always to keep very strong ties with the Gulf. He realized the power they had, the financial power they had, and this is something that Bashar actually terribly failed at capitalizing on, as he failed in many other things.
Yeah. Jihad, how important was the Lebanese banking system to Syria? Because from my understanding, a lot of elite Syrians and merchant families from Syria put their money in Lebanese banks. How important was the Lebanese banking system?
It was very important. Actually, you could say that the Lebanese banking sector was the banking sector of a big part of the Syrian economy, to be honest. If you want individual Syrians, me personally, I know a lot of Syrian friends who had bank accounts just across the border with Lebanon. And all Lebanese banks actually had branches in Shtora, the town which is closest to the border with the Syria. They had branches there almost entirely dedicated to Syrian clients. But it is not only a question of small individual accounts. You have a lot of businesses that have accounts. You even have the Syrian state that has accounts there. And to some extent, this is also the consequence of the fact that you also have actually a lot of the big Lebanese banks are actually historically owned by Syrian individuals. Blom, for example, one of the two largest Lebanese banks, is owned by the Azari family that comes from Latakia. The Bemo banking group comes from the family Abaji, comes from Aleppo, so on and so forth. And you have seen the extent of the dependency of the Syrian economy on the Lebanese banking sector. Of course, both before 2010, when the Syrian banking sector liberalized, and most of the banks that originally opened in Syria were Lebanese owned. But we also saw this in 2019 when the Lebanese banking sector collapsed, and it had actually a terrible impact on the Syrian banking sector and more generally on the Syrian economy and on the Syrian currency, which collapsed because the Lebanese banking sector collapsed. So the relation is very strong, and this is a consequence of the socialist nature of the Syrian economy for a very long period of time. It's due to the fact that you couldn't exchange dollars in Syria, that you couldn't transfer abroad money, that basically, in general, private sector activities were for very long restricted. So despite the liberalization after 2005 in particular, you still had a lot of constraints on banking operations. And that's why you had this dependency with regards to Lebanon.
Yeah, I think the Lebanese angle is very important because I remember when I was in Damascus and my parents wanted to send me some cash. It wasn't as easy to send money. Like, today we take it for granted, but at that time I remember going to Western Union and I had to come out with wheelbarrows of the Syrian lira notes across the city, which was a bit weird. But Jihad, I just want to look at the points which led to the culmination of 2011. We can talk about the banking sector in a bit, but the culmination of like what happened in 2011, I think it's probably been the build-up of like all of what happened, what we've been talking about for the last couple of minutes. But do you think like things like drought, climate change had a big role? And then also at the same time, Jihad, I don't know if you remember, but there was an article by BBC Arabic in 2008 or 9 where it said Damascus real estate was some of the most expensive in the world. So I guess the cost of living for ordinary Syrians was quite hard, right?
Yes, I mean, I think if you want, 2011 was a combination, was the result of a multiplicity of factors, if you want. And the economy played a role, this is obvious. but the politics played a role too. What is interesting, if you really want to study why 2011 began, is to look at the list of demands that members of uh, well, the first protest began mid-March 2011. After 10 days, the Syrian regime sent a delegation to Daraa, south of Damascus, where the protest had begun. And there, the population made a number of demands to that delegation. They made public what they basically wanted. And if you look at these demands, there were like 20 demands. You basically have a list of the reasons why this uprising began. So they have some of them are uh, politically related, so release of political prisoners, uh, political freedoms. Okay, so three or four are related to this. Some of them are related to land ownership. That's a big issue in Syria. Because in Syria, Hassan, and in most of the Middle East, uh, the main source of value is land. It's land and real estate property. Families, if they won't allow their daughter to marry someone if that guy doesn't own a property, it's very different from what you have in the West because of a history of instability, because of depreciating currency. People give a lot of importance to land property, to land ownership, to property ownership. So you had some aspects related to that. And you have some aspects related to the economy, to in particular the decline in the support of the state to the farming sector. The decline in subsidies to gas oil, the decline in subsidies to fertilizers. So it's quite an interesting list of items. So did climate change have an impact? To me, the impact of climate change is quite limited. It is true that the years preceding the uprising, you had a strong decline in agricultural production, and at the same time, drought. But what people don't see enough is that also this period coincided with a very strong decline in the subsidies on fertilizers, seeds, and gas oils sold to farmers. So all these factors combined to a steep decline in agricultural production, to strong rural urban migration, and if you want, if you add this actually to what was happening in Tunisia and Egypt, so you could add to the factors that led to 2011 the development of satellite TV and the fact that people could see was happening there across the Arab world, and to the development of internet. All of these factors together ended up in 2011. I'm myself convinced that the economy played a major role. And actually, if you look at the map of Syria, uh, not in 2011, but in 2014, 2015, when you had much more violence, you realize that the areas that remained outside the regime control were the areas most neglected by the government, the areas where social economic indicators were the lowest. But clearly, when it began, you had a multiplicity of factors. The economy was there, the politics was there, land ownership was there, and so on and so forth.
Yeah, when I remember when the Tunisia uprising was happening in 2010, late 2010, nobody really took that much notice. I mean, obviously there was a bit of press coverage and showing a few protests in Tunis and a few other things, but I think when Ben Ali actually like left the country and it was Tunisia had their revolution, and then I think the bigger one was Egypt when there was big protests in Egypt, and then when Hosni Mubarak
Correct.
won, right? But and then obviously you had the domino effect of Libya and all the other countries. And then I remember, when I was in a cafe in Damascus, and my Arabic wasn't great at the time, but I remember there was an old man, and he basically said something along the lines of like, there will never be uprising in this country. Bashar is loved by all the people, and like if there is an uprising, we're gonna make sure that the population is the same as 1970s. I think what he was trying to say is that Syria's population was 18 million in 1970, and it was 23 million in 2010, 11. So he said we're
Yeah.
willing, we have to, we're gonna kill all these people if we have to,
Yeah.
in order. So like they had this like mentality, right?
Yes. Now, of course, it depends on whom you talked with. Myself, for example, as you said, I completely agree with you. The fall of Mubarak was played a really major role, even more so than Tunisia, because of the central role Egypt has across the Arab world. My feeling in while I was in Damascus at the time, so you and I were at the same time then in Damascus. My feeling then was that uh, it was impossible that nothing happens in Syria. I was convinced that something would happen. Of course, I had absolutely no idea that what happened eventually would happen. But I told myself, it's impossible that things around you change so much and nothing changes in the country. It's impossible. It's the same way if you want, Hassan, like after what happened now and this October 7 and the Israeli attack, it was impossible not to say that something is going to change in the region. We didn't know what. Well, one of the changes was in Syria. You couldn't know what exactly would change. So I realized. So I happened myself to come from a Christian family, I'm a Christian background. So I did hear, unfortunately, a lot of what that gentleman was telling you. You know, there was a lot of fear, particularly from radical Islam. And there were a lot of people saying, well, if people protest, we are going to fight them. We are going. Bashar is great. We are not. And it is clear that Bashar had support not only among minorities, but also among a good part of the urban elite, among a lot of Sunnis. Um, but I think there was also, in among other segments of the population, some sort of excitement, some sort of, very big surprise at what they were seeing on TV. People were really shocked, surprised, and wondering if something could happen and what could happen in the country. But yeah, I think. But it's as everywhere else in any country around the world. Actually, the reaction of people, the position are very mixed because societies are very mixed. I mean, you have differences between classes, you have differences between the urban and rural, between ethnicities, religions, and gender probably. So, but I heard the same things you heard from some people, unfortunately. Absolutely.
Yeah, what was interesting, Jihad, is that I had a friend of mine who was from Halab, from Aleppo, and he came down to Damascus to meet me. And when we were driving around, and obviously my Arabic wasn't great at the time, we were driving around. I remember we were looking for a parking space somewhere, and there was a security guard. This was at a restaurant or something. I can't remember exactly, but the guy, the security guy, he had like a really dirty look on his face because he knew my friend was from Aleppo. And it was just interesting to see there is that like rivalry between different cities across Syria, right? Like, the Damascenes don't like the Aleppans.
Yes, absolutely. There is some rivalry. Now, speaking of Aleppo in particular, but that also applies to other places around the country. You also have, actually, in Aleppo, it's even very strong. In Aleppo, you have very historically very strong tensions between the city itself and its rural background or its rural surroundings. I mean, Aleppo is a very, very old city, historically very rich and very proud about its culture, its heritage. While the rural parts of Aleppo are among the most underdeveloped of the country in terms of socioeconomic indicators. So, for example, in 2012, when the Free Syrian Army entered Aleppo and took control of eastern Aleppo, which is the poorest part of the city, and where a lot of residents actually originate from the rural parts of the countryside of Aleppo. When I know that a lot of Aleppo residents who were supportive of the opposition turned side and became supportive of the regime because they didn't support the fact that people from the countryside, poor, underdeveloped as they perceived them, would come to their city and take control of it. So also that difference between city and rurality was also strong. And of course, you have competition also between Aleppo and Damascus. You need to know that actually before the creation of the Syrian modern state, Aleppo was the real economic engine of what was much bigger and much richer than Damascus. And when the French actually built that state and put that border between Syria and Turkey, Aleppo lost tremendously because most of what is today the southern part of Turkey, like Gaziantep, Antakya, was actually all part of the Aleppo province under the Ottoman Empire. Aleppo lost enormously, and it lost even more after the French decided to designate Damascus as the capital. So Aleppo historically has been very opposed to central power in Damascus, whatever the central state was. Now, things have evolved with time because now Aleppo is much weaker and much smaller and much poorer than Damascus. But yes, you're right. This rivalry, these tensions, they existed. But I would like to add something here, Hassan, is that this type of tensions based on economic development, a lot of factors, they actually exist around the world, in countries around the world. I mean, look at the UK, where the Scots want independence, or at the divide between North and South. Look at Spain, where some regions want to secede. Look, of course, at the atmosphere in the US. The big problem we have in Syria is that we have the same things, but we don't have the tools to manage them. We don't have the freedoms that would enable historian, anthropologists, economists to work on them, to do surveys, to analyze them, to produce reports, so based on which we can debate them, based on which we can build institutions to negotiate compromises and concessions. We have nothing of this. So when there is opposition, when there is tension, when there is rivalry, well, it comes out as very often through violent means. So yeah, I mean, just to put things in perspectives and I think this is something we need to think about for Syria, but for other countries around the world too.
Absolutely. Jihad, when the uprisings happened and the protests in Dara were taking place, and there was the very famous story of the children writing the slogans on the walls, and then the security services arrested them, and allegations are probably of torture, and then of them returning them to their families and basically telling their families that I think one of the sayings was like, you can make new children if you have to, or something like that, and then that obviously led to a snowball effect of more protest. When I was in Damascus, there was a rumor going around that Bashar was on his way down to Dara to apologize to the people and to give compensation, or to like make concessions to the people. But then the story basically goes, or the rumor basically goes, that his brother basically stopped him and said, if you do this, they're going to ask for more, and they're going to ask for more. So it's better to show them led to let them know who's the leader of this country. Do you think that was like a big part of the initial uprisings?
Well, what I think is true is that clearly there was a lot of hesitation at the center of power in the early weeks of the uprising. And I think it is not impossible to think that Bashar could have taken at one point a different path. I don't think it was totally impossible. At the end of the day, he decided to listen to his brother and not to the people who told him, you need to go to Daraa and apologize. What I want to say, Hassan, here is that whether it's him or his brother, at the end of the day, what happened is also the consequence of a change in the structure and nature of the leadership in Syria after the death of Hafez and the arrival to power of Bashar. Hafez al-Assad, so Bashar's father, when he came to power and when he ruled Syria, himself and the officers and the Ba'ath party officials with him, all of them were from a generation that originated from the countryside of Syria, who originated from the army or from the state, who had relatively poor background, who built themselves and their power gradually, rose up if you want, the ladder of basically to get to where they arrived really, who fought really to get there. Bashar al-Assad, he is a son of the city of Damascus. He grew up in Damascus. He inherited power. And his generation, his cousin, for example, Rami Makhlouf, the highly corrupt businessman, well, it's very interesting to look at him, his profile, who resembles a bit Bashar's profile. Because who was the father of Rami Makhlouf? The father of Rami Makhlouf, who was the brother-in-law of Hafez, he was actually a civil, so he was an employee he was a civil servant, a public sector employee, highly corrupt, but he rose the ranks of the public sector. He came from the countryside. His son Rami, like the son of Hafez Bashar, come from the city. They are the son of the internet period, of the neoliberal age, if you want. They are disconnected from the countryside. They are the inherited power. For them, its power and wealth is granted, if you want. So when people from the countryside protest and claim for more wealth, for more justice, for more accountability. This is not something that they can necessarily relate to, understand, answer to, offer solutions to. You see, I think this has played a role in the way this whole generation that came with Bashar has ruled during these years, and the solutions it has offered or has not offered. So when you have Bashar between these, I mean, people telling him go and people telling him no stay, he eventually listened to those of who resemble him, who are like him, who probably think like him, and who told him, these are, as you said, I mean, if beat them rather than accepting anything. I think personally, Hafez al-Assad would have done one of two things. Either he would have gone and slaughtered everyone in Daraa from the first day, which is not what Bashar did, because Bashar, the first day, he killed 6. He didn't slaughter 1,000. And probably if Hafez had slaughtered 1,000, everybody would have kept quiet because we would have been all terrified. Or he would have gone there because he's son of the countryside. He would have understood that this is not how you speak to people. And he would have apologized and would have shaken hands and met in a tent or in a big house or in a mosque with the people from that city, and explained that this will not happen again, and offered financial aid and offered new jobs and things like that. So yeah, I think we need to. There's all this whole background that weighed a lot in terms of decision making at this specific period of time.
I mean, Jihad, not to go back in history too much, but I know a little bit about Syrian history. Don't you think a lot of this goes back to when Syria broke off from Egypt in 1962? And then you had the whole power struggle between, Salah Jadid and Hafez al-Assad. Don't you think that's where a lot of Syria's political structure problems come from?
Yeah, well, actually, it's difficult to say. There is something. There's a very interesting book to read for those who can still find it, because I don't know how many copies of it are still available. It's a book by Patrick Seal, a British journalist, called The Struggle for Syria. Patrick Seal wrote this book in the early 1960s. Why he called it The Struggle for Syria? Because he basically was talking of Syria after independence in the late 40s, early 50s, and throughout the 50s and early 60s. And it describes Syria as a very fragile state, in which there is a struggle between competition between Aleppo and Damascus, in which there is competition between regional actors, which were at the time Egypt and Iraq, and between international actors, USA and USSR. Basically, he's portraying Syria as a scene of struggles by all actors, not an independent actor per se. And then Patrick Steele's second book in 1990, which he doesn't call. So the first book was The Struggle for Syria. The second book, Hassan, he calls it The Struggle for the Middle East. It's basically a biography of Hafez al-Assad. And Patrick Steele in this book says, basically, the struggle for Syria is over. Hafez al-Assad has ensured that he has united Syria, basically, not destroyed Aleppo, but made sure that it was Damascus that ruled. He prevented any foreign intervention into Syrian domestic affairs. And it's not foreign countries that are intervening in Syrian affairs. It's Syria that is intervening in foreign countries' affairs. Basically, Lebanon, by occupying Lebanon, it has a say in also Palestinian-Israeli negotiations. In the Gulf War, it took side, the first Gulf War, 91, it took side with Kuwait against Iraq, it took side with Iran against, and so on and so forth. Basically, he made of Syria a regional actor. And then, if you want, in a way, 2011, what has happened since 2011 is a return to the struggle for Syria. First, Bashar loses Lebanon in 2005, which is a major strategic defeat for the Syrians, and I think which explains to some extent, what happened in 2011. And then you have foreign intervention in Syria. So now it's for long it was Russia, Iran, Turkey, Israel, and then division of Syria between 4 different areas. All this to say that yes, Syria is actually a very new nation, a relatively new country. It took time to have its own identity. I do think Syrians do have an identity, a Syrian identity. They do have it now. They didn't have it at the period you were mentioning it, 1962, and the struggle between the different factions of the Ba'ath Party. But I think now, after 8 years of existence, the country, they do have a national identity, but that does not mean that they are not also divided. As I told you, you have this in a lot of other countries. I do think you can also add to this that there is a weakness, that you have weak institutions in Syria. And that's unfortunately a consequence of this one-man rule for so long. This is a consequence of the terrible 15 years that have destroyed every potential institution and sector and whatever in the past 15 years. So it's a weak country. It's a divided country. As I said, it does not mean, I do think you can have a coexistence of a strong national sentiment, but also of divisions, which make it very difficult to actually reach a solution. How do you manage these two things at the same time while you don't have institutions, even strong individuals on which you can rely, who can serve as example if you want. So I think Syria suffered from a lot of these problems.
Yeah, just not to give you an anecdote, but like I remember when the protest was spreading to Damascus or the outskirts of Damascus, I was on a weekend trip somewhere, and I remember the riot police didn't really know how to react to a lot of these protests. Like a lot of them were like confused in like how to deal with them, because I don't think Syria had dealt with any kind of like uprising like that before, or mobilization of people before, right?
Yeah, you're right. No, it was a very confusing period. I'm sure that a lot of the media didn't know how to react. Actually, a lot of officials didn't know how to react. They were completely unprepared. There's a very, very famous statement by the Minister of Interior at the very first demonstration Hassan, before March 15, there was a demo in Old Damascus in February, I don't know what, after Mubarak fell. And the Minister of Interior goes to to Al-Hariqa. I don't know if you remember that old street in Damascus, yeah. And the Minister of Interior says, "Come on, guys, this is shameful. This is a demonstration. It is shameful. This is a demonstration." So he was telling them, "Are you not realizing it's a demonstration? How shameful this is? This is as if per se a demonstration is something shameful that you should be ashamed of, and as this was totally obvious that the demonstrators would understand. You see, so it tells you how these people are totally unprepared on both sides. That's why a lot of us, I was there. That was our feeling. That from the moment people took to the streets, there was no way back. No way back. People were simply not ready. It was so, something unthinkable to take to the street, to speak, to basically say no. To say no in Syria was, to the rulers, was totally unthinkable. That from the moment they said it, it was over. It was simply over. It was only a question of how much it is going to cost and how much it is going to take time. And of course, in practice, you are never sure if it's going to be over or not. And I think if Bashar had been more intelligent, but there was something you could not go back to after that day, I think. Because, as you were saying, nobody was prepared, because nobody could think that this could ever happen. I think when we didn't discuss this, we cannot discuss everything, of course, in that podcast, is that you had protests actually in Syria in the late 70s and early 80s that ended up with a large-scale civilian massacre in 1982 in Hama, which ended up in the slaughter of anywhere between 5,000 to 25,000 people. We don't know. And there has never been anything said about it. Never official acknowledgement of the massacre, no TV, of course, at the time. And since then, you have had a sort of silence falling on Syrians and on Syria as a whole. And I think this had played an enormous psychological impact on on Syrians, individuals, state officials, everyone really.
When the protests were taking place in 2011, and then I would say the period between 2011 and 2012, there was mostly peaceful protests, and the government reacted with force, with brute force. Let's put it bluntly. They were, doing a lot of, they were resorting to violence. And then between 2012 and 2013, you saw the transformation of a more armed uprising. Um,
Yeah.
would you say that if Bashar had done things differently, this could have turned out very, very differently?
Oh, yeah, yeah, of course, of course, of course. Hassan, the first few protests, people didn't chant, we want the fall of the regime, contrary to Egypt or Tunisia. They would say that people want the reform of the regime. الشعب يريد إصلاح النظام. It was people didn't dare say they want the fall of the regime. It was unthinkable, actually. And really, Bashar had support among large segments of the population uh, because he was seen as young, because he liberalized the economy, because you were earlier saying of how people were wearing, nice clothes, going to Costa Cafe or even to KFC, how surprising it could be for Westerner because these are fast food chains. But because what was impressing Syrians is that at last they could see Western brands in their country and Western ways of consuming. And the West is, of course, is seen as the where modernization is, when the most modern ways of behaving, of acting, of are. And so Bashar was credited for all of this. And as I was telling you, you had actually even some. I mean, myself, I decided to come to live in Syria in 2005 because I thought, despite the fact that I'm writing on Syria, provided I'm careful I keep below some red lines, I keep a very low profile. I could work in Syria because I felt things could be done. You had cafes and bars opening, you had art galleries opening, you had, as you were saying, places to go out, restaurants, cafes, plenty of things. You could do tourism, you could go to hotels around the country. So Bashar had support in 2011, and Bashar had a number of options. I remember very well a discussion we had some friends in after the beginning of the first protest, and a friend it was either me or him, one of us were saying, well, if it takes 2 years before he does any reform, I'm five. And the other I said, oh, let him take 5 years. We don't care. People were not in hurry. He had a lot of credit. He could do a lot of things. You were there obviously when he pronounced his speech before Parliament at the end of March. There were huge expectations for the speech, and it was a catastrophe. Actually, the speech. He was even laughing, and it shocked everyone because people expected him to be mourning, to be announcing a few days of official mourning after the death in southern Syria. So I'm sure things could have taken a different direction. But unfortunately, they took the direction they took. But he had certainly the political support. And remember, even the first statement coming from Hillary Clinton, who was Secretary of State at the moment, were very positive. After the beginning of the uprising and the first death, she was saying he's a guy we can work with. So even internationally, he had support. And people tend to forget that the Turks were very strong allies. Davutoglu, I don't know how many times he visited Damascus between March and August 2011 before the Turks really took a hard line. I mean, the Turks did support the opposition, but they were really pushing Bashar to make some concessions. So it did take quite a while before, there was international sanctions against him and opposition. And internally, he had really support. He could have done a lot of things, but unfortunately, he made the decisions he made, and we ended up where we are today.
Would you say the period between, say, 2013 and 2015, Bashar al-Assad or the regime of Bashar al-Assad was in a bit of trouble because, like, if you look at what happened between 2013 or 2012 to 2015, you had this a lot of armed rebel groups, different, albeit fragmented, and then backed by different countries and different players. There was that one time before Russia entered in 2015, Bashar al-Assad was in a lot of trouble, right?
Oh, yeah, yes, of course. Well, don't forget that before Russia intervened, Hezbollah intervened, and Hezbollah prevented the collapse of the regime a first time. Then that was not enough, so the Iranians intervened, and that was still not enough. So they had to rush and call the Russians. So you very correctly point out at all this period, at various moments of the conflict, the regime was very close to collapsing. Each time he had to increase the level of support from international actors to survive. So even with the support of Hezbollah and the support of the Iranians, and so a lot of militias, Shia militias from Afghanistan, from Iraq, from Iran, he could still not survive. And he needed the Russians. And of course, the Russian intervention made the big difference.
And then Jihad, would you say from like 2015 when Russia intervened, and then a lot of things happened, like sanctions happened, and then the whole idea of this war economy, in addition to Iranian and Russian influence and investment, how was the Syrian economy from say 2011 or 2012 to say 2015 onwards?
Yeah, I wrote a paper for the for EECFR, the European Council on Foreign Relations, about the Syrian war economy. I think it's called like this. I forgot the name. In 2016, I think I wrote it, or 2014, I forgot. And highlighted a number of stages through which the economy went. So obviously, since then, you have had a number of other stages. Clearly, I mean, the economy has declined across the past 12 years. Now, if you specifically look at the 2012-2015 period, so you have had 2012-2013, if I remember, were really bad. You have some years where the situation stabilized a bit. In generally speaking, Hassan, the situation of the economy was a reflection of, again, a multiplicity of factors. So the level of violence across the country, the level of destruction of the economic assets, and the fragmentation of the country into a number of areas. When sanctions were imposed, for example, you had decline in economic activity. So you have like this number of stages. And generally speaking, so you had quite a steep decline during this period. But you have some years, if I'm not wrong, maybe 2014, where the economy stabilized a bit. But not once during this whole period you had the economy growing, obviously. And then afterwards, 2019 and 2020, a very steep collapse. But that's we are talking of a later period. But yes, I mean, the Syrian economy, you need to know that it relied a lot on oil exports. And when the EU banned oil purchases from Syria, you had, and sanctioned the Syrian economy in general, you had a significant impact on economic activity. And then the war, the destruction of the business infrastructure. 2012, for example, was very violent. As you were saying, the peaceful demonstrations transformed into a violent conflict. A lot of factories around Aleppo, for example, were stolen and shipped. The equipment was sold in Turkey and other parts in other countries, and so you had a steep decline in manufacturing production, for example. So yeah, I would say general decline across all business sectors throughout the period.
And like obviously Bashar al-Assad's government didn't have control of the entire country, right? So like you had different groups,
no, of course,
different areas.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you could say that quite early on, actually, it lost control of large parts of the country, and from 2012 onwards, you could say that large segments of the country were out of control of the regime. In 2012, it handed over actually most of the northeast to the PKK, the Syrian branch of the PKK. Then in the summer of 2012, it lost, as I said, the FSA, the Free Syrian Army, took over eastern Aleppo, and then some suburbs of Damascus were lost. And so it lost large parts of the country, where you had actually local communities organizing themselves. But the absence of the state obviously was also an important factor in economic deterioration, because the state obviously remained a major economic actor as an investor, as a spender, and so on.
And then obviously Syria had suffered from sanctions, right, from the US and from the EU and from other countries as well.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, Syria, I mean, sanctions have been imposed. Initially, you had in May 2011 the first sanctions imposed by the EU, if I'm not wrong, on Bashar, on his wife, his brother, and so on. Then in at the end of 2011 on the oil sector, then on the banking sector. And these obviously had an important impact on the Syrian economy. Of course, we need to be careful when we talk of sanctions because for a lot, at least people of my generation, I'm now 53, I know, I mean, a lot of us have worked on sanctions or read about the subject, know about the impact of the embargo imposed by the UN on Iraq after the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait and the terrible impact it had on Iraqi society. But Syria was not under embargo by the UN, meaning that it was under sanction by the US and the EU, but it was not under sanction by any country in the BRICS, any BRICS country, any African country, South American country, or any Asian country, except Japan and South Korea. But it was, I mean, the importance of the US in international financial transactions mean it's very difficult to conduct banking transactions with Syria, and this has a real negative impact on economic, to this day, on economic transaction with Syria. So Western sanctions on Syria are, of course, an important negative, have an important negative impact on economic activity in the country.
And then how important was the involvement of Russia and Iran in this period, do you think? Because like, did it save the Syrian economy, would you say?
Well, to be frank, it did. They did help the Syrian economy. I mean, and actually you can see now, now that the Russian and the Iranians are no more supporting the economy. You can see the difference. I mean, the Iranians since 2013 have been regularly providing oil for Syria. First, providing on credit, then under discounted price. In the past period, I don't know at what price they were selling the oil to Syria, but they were selling around 55 to 60,000 barrels of crude oil to Syria per day. So, which is not an insignificant amount. The Russians were providing less support, but they were still providing wheat. Syria historically is a wheat producer and exporter, but in the past years, it has been an importer. As you know, as everybody knows, bread is a very important consumer product in Syria, and the Russians have been providing wheat. Now Syrians have a problem with securing both oil products and wheat. So yes, they have been supporting economically the country. The Iranians are talking of billions of dollars of support to the Syrian government. The Russians less than that, but still quite significant, of course. So it's not only a military and political support they provided to the regime, but also economic support to the Syrian economy.
And then jihad, this is a very widely reported or widely publicized one, is the drug trade that the Assads and their associates got involved in, with involvement of production of Captagon. How important was that to supporting his regime?
It is well. It is. I mean, the past 2 years you have seen really a surge in Captagon sales. It is clearly a very important source of revenue for the regime itself. Knowing that the country generates very little export revenues, around $1 billion per year. Captagon exports were close to that figure, a bit less, a bit more. It's very difficult to get a precise number around that. The difference between goods exports and Captagon exports is, of course, that Captagon exports revenues go directly to the pocket of regime people. So to some extent, you could say that Syria was a narco state, and Captagon revenues were very important source of revenue to fund the operations of the palace, to enrich, I mean, the palace, to fund the militias. So I would say, yes, it was a very important source of revenue. It was also an important source of conflict with the Gulf countries, which were at the receiving end, given that Captagon was consumed by their population. But yes, you could say that Captagon was really important for the regime.
Do you think, like, then, especially like countries like the UAE, they recognized that Bashar al-Assad was winning in terms of territory, gains, and they wanted to stop all this flow of drugs to their countries. Do you think that's why they brought him in, like back to the Arab League and back to the the Arab political landscape in I would say 2020, 2019?
Yes, well, as you may know, the UAE reopened its embassy in 2018 in Damascus, and then things accelerated after the earthquake in February 23, and after which Syria was invited to the Arab League and so on. Yes, I mean, Captagon was one dimension. The other was, some Arab countries such as Jordan were more interested in refugees returning. Others were interested, such as Saudi Arabia, potentially in a reduction in Iranian influence. But I think, Hassan, the most important reason for resuming ties with the regime is that not resuming ties with the regime didn't bring them anything, and resuming ties, in their opinion, didn't cost them much. And you see this when you look at the practical results of the resumption of ties, which were close to nothing, actually. So, for example, the Emiratis opened their embassy in Syria in 2018. You've seen almost no single UAE investment in 6 years in Damascus. Oh, partly because the Syrians have been incapable of capitalizing on this. But even when you look at the resumption of Syrian Saudi ties, it took almost a year for a Saudi ambassador to be appointed. Again, no financial aid, no support, as if the Gulf had no illusions about the capacity of the regime or the willingness of the regime to make any compromises. So the Captagon issues were mentioned, the refugee return issue was mentioned, but the regime clearly was not interested or not capable of delivering on any of these aspects. But I think the Gulf saw no specific interest in not restoring ties. It didn't see this as a means of pressure on him, so they decided to reopen embassy and restart to restore diplomatic relation and see what they could do from then on. And obviously, they got nothing either from doing this.
A lot of people, analysts, say that the war came to a standstill in 2020. Obviously 2020 was a very difficult year for a lot of people with the COVID pandemic and also economic contraction. Between that period up until, say, 2024, how was Syria's economy doing?
Terrible. It was probably economically the worst period for the Syrian economy. Just to give you one indicator, because it's among probably the only indicator that is easily available, which is the exchange rate in the black market of the dollar. So between 2011 and 2019, the value of the dollar in the Syrian foreign exchange market was multiplied by 10. From 47, $1 was worth 47 pounds in 2011 to 500 in 2019. And from 2019 to 2024, it was multiplied by 30, from 500 to 15,000. The reason being, the single most important reason being the collapse of the Lebanese banking system at the end of 2019. The very rapid depreciation in the value of the Lebanese pound and the very rapid depreciation of the value of the Syrian currency. The fact that billions of dollars of Syrian deposits were blocked in Lebanese bank accounts. You add to that, of course, the COVID-19 pandemic. And you add to that so that was early 2020. You add to that the imposition of the Caesar Act, that's a law passed by the U.S. Congress imposing new sanctions on Syria. So these were all between mid-2019 and mid-2020. And since then, you have had a very serious collapse in economic and social indicators in Syria. And Syrians living in Damascus tell you the situation was something before 2019, it was already bad. But since 2019, it's entirely different. It was much, much worse. And since then, actually, you have had really a feeling, because you need to think about one thing, because at a number of moments during the conflict, there was a feeling among Syrians that right now it's over, reconstruction is going to start. So, for example, when the Emiratis opened their embassy, most pockets controlled by the opposition around Damascus, around Homs, are taken back by the regime. There is a strong feeling that it's over. Now there's reconstruction is starting. I remember myself having written an article, for example, after the fall of Aleppo in 2016, in December 2016, same thing. And I remember myself having written an article in Al Hayat a few months later, saying that there won't be reconstruction, don't be fooled. There's nothing that will help, that will generate reconstruction at this time. But Syrians were convinced of that. And you had this several times during the conflict. After 2020, it was over. People realized there was nothing would happen. A small hope came again after the earthquake and the restoration of Syria's seat in the Arab League. But again, quite quickly in the summer of 2023, people realized that nothing would happen. Bashar Al-Assad gave an interview to Sky News saying, you should not expect anything specific from our restoration in the Arab League. And then quickly after that, you had protests in Sweden, southern Syria. Anyway, you had, you have a continued outflow of for example, of Syrians leaving the country again. People learning German to leave so that they could go to Germany and work there. So you could really say that after 2020, the deterioration in the economic conditions was really very marked. Was really much worse, if you want.
If we fast forward to 2024, I don't want to. I know that the Russia-Ukraine conflict obviously had an impact as well with regards to wheat and other things. But if we're just focusing on Syria, 2024 is going to be probably the most pivotal year in Syria's modern history. Run me through what you thought was happening when the initial rebel advances were happening in, say, November, December 2024.
Well, it's pretty straightforward, pretty simple, Hassan. The offensive began on November 27. On November 26, I was in Brussels attending a one-day event called the Core Donors Event meeting organized by the EU to discuss the plan by donor countries for Syria for the following year. Everybody was in the mood of the regime is staying. We have to move from humanitarian aid to early recovery. They invited for the first time people who are not at all related to the Syrian, who are not related to the Syrian state, but people coming from an organization who had been based in Syria for a long period of time and who had never been invited before. In other words, they were planning to normalize in a way or another with working within Syria. And then, so if you want, on November 26th, there was a general feeling that the regime was here to stay, and that there was no way it would be going away anytime soon. And then the following day, you have the attack. And I remember because on that following day, I had traveled from Brussels to Geneva to another meeting on supporting local development by another foundation, by a private foundation, where we were discussing this. We were surprised, and I remember telling myself and discussing with friends actually, why is HTS attacking? It doesn't make sense. Even more deaths we're going to have. People are exhausted. People don't want to die, and people are tired, and so on and so forth. So it certainly came as a surprise. What I would say, however, is that there is something that we knew. I knew, at least within our team, because we've been working on this. It's basically our daily work for 24 years. It is the total collapse of Syrian state institution, the overwhelming poverty, the far-reaching deterioration of economic of services, of the institutions, of the infrastructure, just name it. I remember, and I say it because I made a lot of predictions that turned out completely wrong over these 14 years. But a few months earlier, I can't remember when, in August, September, I was discussing with friends, I was telling them, if a day that the opposition decides to attack Aleppo, I'm sure they would take it in 2 or 3 days. Of course, I had no idea that they would attack, and I also thought that they would never be able to take Homs. So just to be very clear. Why did I say that? Because if you want, it was clear that outside of the core regime areas, Damascus, Homs, and coastal area, the regime was very, very weak. I told you a bit earlier that in 2012, the regime had handed over the northeast to the Syrian branch of the PKK in 2012. Imagine, Hassan, in 2012, the Syrian army was still in full shape. The uprising had barely turned into a conflict, and already then they considered themselves unable to control the northeast as an army. So it was obvious that in 2024 they would be unable to control a city like Aleppo. So from this is quite clear. What is, however, surprising is the decision by the Iranians and the Russians, basically really mainly by the Russians, not to support the regime, or if you want, the green light that was given to the regime. When I told you just now that I was telling friends that the day the opposition would attack Aleppo, they would take it 2 or 3 days, but I also told them that nobody would let them do this because the whole international community is in support of the regime, which is obviously wrong. This is, if you want, what happened at the end of 2024 is a combination of 2 things. It's a combination of domestic and international factors. It's a combination of the exhaustion of the regime, the military apparatus and the civilian administration, and the destruction of the Iranian security system within Syria, and a Russian decision whose motivations are not very clear, not to support the Syrian regime as we thought they would support it. This combination of factors ended up in the very rapid fall of Aleppo, which I think took everybody by surprise, including HTS. And I think the very rapid fall of Aleppo had a very important role in the acceleration of the events, in the sense that I think that HTS at this moment realized, well, let's move on then. Maybe even the Russians, the decision not to support the regime only came after they realized that the Syrian army was unwilling to fight. I'm not sure. This is pure speculation. I have no expertise in military affairs. But yes, I think it's the combination of these situations. But if you want the exhaustion of the regime, both military and civilian apparatus, it was quite clear for a very, very long period of time.
Yeah, the speed of which everything happened, I think, just shocked me. Like back into it, like I said, the period between 2012 and 2015, he was in a lot of trouble. So, like, what happened in 2024 basically could have happened in 2012 or to 2015 if Russia and Iran and other actors didn't step in. So, I guess like the external, Russia's war in Ukraine and then Iran being busy with Hezbollah in Lebanon and other things as well. I guess that also played a big role in why they didn't really support Bashar al-Assad in Syria.
Yes, absolutely. You are right. However, what surprised me, for instance, is that to me, and I think all analysts have an estimate of the HCS force of being around 25 to 30,000 fighters. And I was surprised by the fact that Homs, the city of Homs, which is very strategic because it opens the road to the coastal area, was not defended more strongly. I mean, maybe a quarter of the city is inhabited by members of the Alawite community. So we are talking of dozens of people, maybe 100,000 persons. How come they didn't fight more for it? This is what is quite striking. And I think there was really, as I was telling you, I mean, this level of exhaustion has really collapsed among the loyalist camp, and total disgust at the regime, which is much deeper than what we thought. Because, as you said, even look at what you're saying, the weakening of Hezbollah. Even myself, I told myself, okay, if I'm the Iranians, I want to keep at least a line of supply open with Lebanon, which has to go through Syria. So I'm going to fight for Homs, because if I lose Homs, it's over. The battle is over. I mean, they're going to get to Damascus, and the supply line with Lebanon is cut. And I was surprised. So obviously they were exhausted by the Israeli attack, the Israeli bombing, but I didn't think it was to that extent. But yeah, apparently it was. That's the only thing I can say.
Jihad, you wrote a tweet a couple of weeks, or about a month so ago, when I think you visited Syria, the new Syria, or post Bashar Al-Assad Syria. What was your thoughts? I know you wrote a long thread, what your thoughts were, but from me asking you, what are your thoughts on the new economy in Syria?
Um, I would say that the situation is quite worrying. Um, Obviously, at the moment, the situation is bad. However, if you look at it, um, so today, I mean, we are expecting the EU to announce a lifting of its sanctions on Syria. But my sentiment is that the Americans are going to keep their sanctions for the foreseeable future, and this is going to remain a major obstacle to large-scale reconstruction of the country. But anyway, to go back to the current state of the economy, the situation of the economy is bad. Um, you were mentioning a bit earlier Russian and Iranian support. So previously we had Western sanctions, but we had Iranian and Russian support. Today we still have Western sanctions, but we don't have Iranian and Russian support. What I learned while in Syria is that the countries, and that is what is a bit surprising to me at this stage, is that the countries that are supporting the new authorities in Damascus are not providing financial support. The Turks, the Qataris, for example, talked of supplying 2 ships to supply electricity. But the Minister of Electricity told us that actually both the Turks and the Qataris are asking to be paid for the fuel that will operate these ships. So it's not a grant actually by Ankara or Doha. They are just selling the electricity to the Syrians at market price, and the Syrians don't have the means to do that. And it's quite telling that until a few weeks ago, the Syrian government was saying that by the end of February, we hope to provide 8 hours of electricity per day across the country. Now they're saying we hope to provide 8 hours of electricity per day by the end of the year. So it has changed from by the end of February to the end of the year. They talked of increasing salaries by 400% of the public sector, which is, I think, an announcement which was irresponsible to make before you make sure you get the money for that. Not only no increase has been made, but no salary has been paid for neither the month of January or February, or sorry, December or January. And so the situation is really bad. Funding does not seem to be coming from abroad. Sanctions, hopefully, the EU lifting sanctions will help a bit. But as I said, the US maintaining its sanctions on the financial sector will remain very problematic, will prevent normal banking transactions. So I'm very worried. I do think that the economic situation will improve. And if you look at GDP, it will probably be better than last year, very simply because we won't have anymore these thugs ruling the country, controlling all lucrative business sectors. You already have, for example, investors who are returning, Syrian investors, of course, I'm talking about. So you are going to have a lot of private investors returning, a lot of Syrians, members of the diaspora. You have expats going back, spending money, which is also good, bringing in dollars. So you are going to have some limited improvement in economic activity. But for things to improve markedly, you need massive inflow of funds. You need the government to invest and to spend. You need international funding commitment. So far, we haven't seen much of this. There is a conference in Brussels in mid-March by the donors community. So let's see how this turns out. Knowing, for example, that one major donor, usually the largest single donor, or the second largest, is the USAID, which is being dismantled by the Trump administration. So yes, I would say the I would say I'm a bit worried, to be honest, at the moment. I'm a bit worried. I do think that things will get a bit better, but the situation is so bad that getting a bit better is simply not enough.
I mean, to me, I think a lot of countries are still quite, especially regional countries, they're still quite hesitant, right, to deal with Ahmed al-Shara's regime, administration, or the new administration, because they don't really understand who's ruling the country and who's running things. But it seems like there's Turkey's getting more involved and Qatar seems to be getting more involved. But like you said, they're only giving like only a little bit, not too much political involvement at the moment.
Yes, absolutely. Now, what is surprising is, if you want, I think he has tried as much as possible to show that he is not actually working for the Qataris or Turks. My understanding actually is that both Ankara and Doha are not extremely happy by the fact that he's seeking to be independent, that he made the choice to, well, his first foreign visit was to Saudi Arabia. They have been visiting the UAE 2 or 3 times. I think Shebani, the foreign minister, has been going to Saudi to the UAE a couple of times. He's come to Paris. They're really trying to. I have a lot of people who have met him and have told me at the same time. He's trying to have his own independent path as much as he can. But obviously, if nobody is willing to provide him funding, it's going to be very problematic. And probably one of the reasons the Turks and the Qataris are not providing significant funds or even any meaningful funds is a consequence of him wanting to remain independent and not necessarily obeying their orders, if I were to put it in a straightforward manner. So it's a bit surprising to me, the little level of support he's receiving, especially given, I mean, Syria is still very unstable. You have so Sharia is certainly in control of Damascus and the main cities, but large segments of the country are not under his control. And given the presence of ISIS, given the refugee question, given the high level of poverty, the insecurity in large parts of the country, you would think that they would everybody has an interest in stabilizing the country, in strengthening Sharia before, because in any case, Syria will need a lot of funding. So you have a lot of cards in hand in the foreseeable future. But now there's immediate urgency in making sure that we get energy supply and food supply. The basic infrastructure is repaired, and the salaries are paid. And it's worrying that even these basic needs are not being met, and that nobody is willing to have the government to meet them.
Who's going to pay for a lot of this reconstruction, do you think? Because I really don't see anybody at the moment looking, to invest a lot of money in Syria. I don't see the Chinese coming. I don't see the Saudis investing a lot. Do you think this is going to take this? To me, this is going to take a really long time, right, to rebuild Syria?
Yes, I agree with you. I mean, again, let's not forget where we were on November 26th of last year. I think, to me, the priority now is not the large-scale reconstruction of the country; it's the immediate improvement of living conditions and social conditions. Before we are going to attract, for example, foreign investors, we need first to attract Syrian investors. No foreign investor is going to come if he sees that Syrian investors are not coming. So this is going to be a first step. In terms of other governments funding, yes, you're right. I mean, Syria needs probably dozens of billions to rebuild. But in any case, even if you had commitments today by regional countries or IFIs, Syria doesn't have the international financial institutions. Syria does not have today the capacity to manage this type of funds, this level of funds. So it's fine if it doesn't get these big amounts of funding. But that does not mean that it cannot, Syria is not going to receive some funding. So, for example, if you look at the humanitarian aid effort in the past 10 years, the UN, through various donor countries, has already spent dozens of billions on Syria in the past decade on humanitarian aid. If this money shifts into early recovery and reconstruction money, even if it's $2, $3, $4 billion per year, and every country committing a few $100 million, that would already be would provide some help. But I agree with you. I don't see massive amounts of aid coming. But maybe this is not what is not maybe. I don't think this is what is required at this stage. You can aim for lower amounts of money, at least for the first 2 to 3 years. But at least if you kickstart the economy, you have stabilized it. You start attracting the first few foreign investment. You get a bit of money to rebuild the infrastructure, and from then on, you start thinking about what you can do, and to attract more funds, and to pool these funds into larger scale projects and investment. But it is true that beyond Syria, I think you don't have any more the willingness or the appetite by Saudi Arabia, by the UAE, by other Gulf countries, by even the EU, to put the amount of money that they used to put, say, in the past to help Lebanon or to help other countries to support them. They want profits. They want to make profit out of their money. So it will be a challenge. But at the moment, Syria needs much less than what most people think about when they talk about reconstructing the whole country.
Jihad, as we bring the podcast to a close shortly, I just got two questions for you. The first is, like, obviously we're an Islamic finance focused podcast. Do you see a role for Islamic finance in the new Syrian economic paradigm?
Yes, of course I do. I mean, Syria already has 4 Islamic banks, including 3 that were established before 2011. They are among the largest in the country. And given the ideology of the new authorities in Syria, I wouldn't be surprised that they are given more prominence in the next years. So I don't see any reason for Islamic finance not to get increasingly important in the coming years. So yes, I do see certainly some importance. I mean, I need to say also some of the Islamic banks actually have seen a rise in their assets in the past couple of years, contrary to conventional banks, for example.
And then, like, tied to that, Jihad, there's been some talk on social media, and I think this was also reported in the news recently, is that Syrian authorities are considering using Bitcoin as a legal tender or as currency in the country. Do you think that could help a lot of Syria's economic challenges?
It could help, but I think at this stage it would be only at the margin. I do think, I mean, obviously from the moment you have had, I mean, what this says is, of course, it says a lot about the nature of the new rulers in Damascus, who are younger in age, who are all very strong in terms of knowledge, technology, know-how. Even apparently when they arrived to Damascus, and I'm talking here of HTS and the Syrian Salvation Government, which ruled Idlib, which was historically one, as I was saying, one of the least developed part of Syria. But under HTS, it has been much more developed and have developed all sorts of technological tools. And they realized that the Syrian central state was really very old in the way it functioned. And the discussion about bitcoins also reflects to some extent how much they are looking into new technologies to rebuild the state. And of course, you have here the sanctions dimension, which is important. And the use of bitcoins in Idlib was not insignificant, actually. But at the end of the day, the importance of Bitcoin will only reflect the importance of it in the global financial flows with Syria, in or out of Syria. And if most donor countries, most funding, most investment comes through traditional systems, traditional processes, well, the size of Bitcoin, I think, would remain relatively restricted. But I do see this certainly as a potential area of, a sector that probably looks relatively promising in Syria, more than in several other countries in the region.
Yeah, I mean, like, if you look at it, right, El Salvador tried to do Bitcoin like legal tender, but then they got themselves into like a bit of financial trouble, and then the IMF has like given them a new credit line, and like one of the conditions is that they scale back their
Exactly.
ambitions.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, exactly.
But Jihad, tell us any projects you may be working on, any upcoming projects you may be working on.
Well, Hassan, that will be what I'll be looking at on my next trip to Damascus. So I'll be flying in 10 days, Beirut and Damascus. What we are going to try to do first is expand our team, working to continue doing what we are doing currently. There is a lot of information, of new developments to be tracking. So that's one of the things we'll be doing, and building on this, and building on my meetings that I will hold in Damascus with both officials and the private sector. I will have a clearer picture of which direction I should work on. At this present time, I don't have anything clear, unfortunately, to tell you. But clearly, I'm looking. Yeah, I mean, I've been out of Syria for 12 years. I had not been able to return to Syria for 12, or actually even 13 years. So the feeling all of us who can now return, that everything is possible today in Syria. And so I'm really looking very much forward to launching new projects, certainly.
And Jihad, what's the best way to read your research? And are you active on social media?
Yes, of course. So, well, the best way is to subscribe. So that also generates more money to me. So it makes me happy. So that's directly on our website. So we are on Twitter, of course, and we are on LinkedIn too. So either on the website, Syria-report.com. On Twitter, we are at the Syria Report, and on LinkedIn, you can find us too. So these are the three feeds where you can find us.
And are you yourself active on social media?
Yes, Jihad Yaziji, absolutely. I'm on Twitter. That's where I publish most of my what I have to say this week. So yeah, absolutely. I'm on Twitter, and on Twitter in English, and on Facebook in Arabic, actually.
Fantastic. I'll link it in the show notes after our conversation. But Jihad, this has been a really fantastic conversation down memory lane, and looking at what's happening in Syria and what's going to happen in the coming years. And I really hope that they get their act together, and that they can once again be a country, of prosperity and of peace.
Hassan, thank you very much for having me. Thank you very much again.
Thank you. If you made it this far, you must have enjoyed that episode. If you did enjoy that episode, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. It really helps us bring you more great insights. Follow us on LinkedIn and Instagram for the latest updates. Got feedback or guest suggestion? Email me at hassan@majlisandmarkets.com.